Hey everyone, welcome to Medvice, where I'll be helping you out with tips, tricks, and advice on all things medicine. In this video, I'll be giving you guys some tips based on my own experience when it came to the USMLE Step 1 exam. Tip number 1 would be to plan ahead of time when you plan on writing your USMLE Step 1 exam. A lot of the time, people, what they do is they wait to schedule the exam, or what they'll do is they'll schedule the exam, and when it gets close, they'll cancel it or reschedule it for another time because it gets kind of scary around that time. But my advice, based on my experience and based on what I've seen from other people, would be to schedule that exam ahead of time. Once you schedule that exam, you keep that date, you don't change it. That way you're going to be pushed to study and make sure you're ready for that time when that time comes and you have to write that exam. Another tip I'd like to give you guys is to make sure that you write the USMLE Step 1 exam before you start your clinical rotations. This is important because I saw a lot of students during my clinical rotations that were doing their rotations but they haven't written their Step 1 exam yet. I think it's really important to make sure that exam is out of the way before you begin those clinical rotations, because once you learn all that material and you've gotten through the exam, you can then start to apply those things during your rotations, and you can also kind of connect the dots and start to connect all the information you learned with actual clinical scenarios. That actually helps you in the long run, and it's way better than not writing the exam, and when you start doing your rotations, then you start to learn those things on the go, and then you're also starting to learn things about Step 2 CK and Step 1, and it gets all confusing, and then when you have to study for Step 1, then you know what I mean, it gets confusing. So I think it's a better idea to make sure that Step 1 is written before you start the clinical rotations. Another thing I would like to say is, from what I've seen, there are a lot of students that are in schools that do have policies to make sure that that Step 1 is written before they start the clinical rotations. So that's a good thing, but there are also a lot of schools that don't have that policy at all. And in that case, that's when you're going to see students that are doing their rotations that haven't done their Step 1 exams. So if you fall into that category, I'd really recommend you to write that exam, schedule it on your own, and make sure that exam is written before the rotations, because it's going to help you out in your long run. Alright, now that we got that out of the way, let's talk about how we can study and how we can prepare for the USMLE Step 1 exam. So I know that this kind of information is all over the internet. You'll find it on forums, you'll find it on YouTube, teachers and students will tell you about how they studied for the exam, but this is just going to be my perspective and basically what I did to study for this exam and score a really good mark. So the two most important things that I used when it came to study for the Step 1 exam was, number 1 would be the first aid, the USMLE first aid book, and number 2 would be Uworld. I'm sure you guys have heard that all over the place, but that's what I did. So first I'm going to start off with how I studied for the USMLE Step 1 when it came to the first aid and Uworld, and I'll tell you guys what I did incorrectly and what I would have done if I were to redo this all over again. And the last side note I'd like to make about the USMLE first aid book is, a lot of the time, this happened to me a lot when I was studying when I was reading through the book. A lot of the time I would see topics, I would just skim by the topics, because you'd see something like, like polycystic kidney disease or pheochromocytoma, and you'd see it and you'd be like, oh, I know what that is, just move on, and you start highlighting all the rest of your notes. But a lot of the time you think you know that stuff in depth, but if you were to look it up online, or if you were to look at your old notes from school, I guarantee you'll see something there that you didn't know at the time. And when you're writing that exam, they're not looking to see if you know what that disease is. They're looking to see if you can apply the different concepts of the disease and the etiology of the disease and how it came to be on the cellular level as well. So that's why a lot of the time when you see this basic topics when you're running through that first aid, if you feel like you don't know that topic 100%, if you ever feel that way, then go back and look at all your notes and just supplement either your notebook or your first aid with all the details that you can about that topic, because in the end it's going to help you a lot, because you need to know the details of every single topic that's in that first aid book. Because if you just study the book itself and not the details of all the different concepts, then that's not going to be enough. You need to know every single thing about the first aid book. So now let's talk about Uworld. So I want to show you guys how to use Uworld so that you get the most out of it. So if you don't know what Uworld is, I'll explain it very briefly, but just don't depend on me, you can look it up yourself online. But it's basically a question bank. It comes with about between 2,200 and 2,500, maybe even more questions. They have a question bank for the Step 1, the Step 2 CK, and they even have something for the Step 2 CS. So when it comes to the Step 1, their question bank is amazing. Basically what it is you download the Uworld, you make an account, and it has every single category that's basically in your first aid and every category in medicine. So pathology, behavioral science, biochemistry, genetics, all that stuff. It categorizes the questions into subcategories, and you can do the questions in certain blocks. The blocks can be whether 10 questions, 15, however many questions you want in each block. And then you can even time yourself, or you can even do the questions untimed as well. So once you finish reading the first aid and you make sure that you understand every concept that's in that book, now you can purchase the subscription for Uworld and you can start doing Uworld questions. So what I did was, after I finished reading the first aid book, I would do the Uworld questions in 40 question blocks. So I would do 40 questions and I would time it. So if you click the timed option, it'll give you 1 hour to do 40 questions. I would do about 2 to 3 blocks a day. It would take me, I'd be studying for maybe 10 to 12 hours a day, but that's because I shortened my time for studying for the step 1, and I studied for it between 3 and 4 months. So once you do that, you do 40 questions and you time yourself, and you can do maybe however many blocks that you're capable of doing per day. So every time you complete a block, it'll tell you exactly how many of the questions that you got right out of the 40 questions. It'll also give you an explanation for every single question. It'll even give you an explanation for all the wrong choices out of the multiple choices and the correct choice as well. So what I highly recommend you doing, because this is what's going to guarantee a high mark on the USMLE Step 1, is to go through all the right answers, obviously, and the wrong answers as well. So let's say you do question number 5 and you get it wrong. You're obviously, the first thing you're going to do is look at what the right answer was, and you're going to write notes on the right answer. And a lot of the time students will skip on and move to the next question. But the thing is, a lot of the information that are in the wrong answers are also very important, because that information could be tested on in the USMLE Step 1 as well, not just the one that was correct on that number 5 question. So it's very important to make sure that every single answer, every single explanation that they have in Uworld, you take those notes. You can either write it down in a notebook separately, or you can find that topic in your first aid book. Let's say that the question number 5 that you did was based on, let's say, the Krebs cycle or something in biochemistry, and they have an entire explanation for choices A, B, C, D, and E. So you take those choices, they're going to be probably about 3 to 4 sentences long. You find that page in your first aid book, and then you can supplement that page with notes from your first aid. So if you look at my first aid, I have writing all over it. I have highlighting and I have writing. Most of that writing in my first aid book is actually notes that are straight from USMLE World, from Uworld. So that helped me so much, especially when I was studying. That made my first aid book like completely full of information. Every time I open, I still use that first aid book because there's just so much information packed into that book, because I supplemented 2,400, 2,500 questions. I supplemented all of those answers and all the information from there because I want to absorb as much of it as I could, because you know, it's very expensive. So I took all of it and I transferred it into my first aid book. That way, when you're studying for that exam, once you're all done Uworld and you're all done your first aid, that one first aid book that you have or any other notes that you have, that's going to be your legend. That's going to be your key to doing great on the USMLE Step 1 exam. So another topic that I want to discuss when it comes to Uworld is the self-assessments. When you're purchasing Uworld, a lot of the time you can buy it just by itself, the QBank by itself, or you can also purchase the 2 self-assessments that they have. One thing I want to tell you guys, those self-assessments are amazing. Those self-assessments helped me a lot. They basically have self-assessment number 1 and 2. What I did was I wrote self-assessment 1, the first one, about halfway into my studying, when I was pretty much halfway through Uworld, because I just wanted to see what mark they would give me. The second self-assessment, I really recommend that you save that assessment for maybe 1 or 2 weeks prior to your exam, maybe even a few days before your exam if you're comfortable with that. So the reason why I love these USMLE self-assessments so much is that once you're done writing it, well, first of all, when you're writing the exam, it feels like you're actually writing the USMLE, because the questions are hard. They're harder than the actual Uworld QBank questions. Some people even say that they're harder than the actual USMLE questions, but I would say they're just about the exact same difficulty level as the actual exam, which is why I love the self-assessment so much. So once you're writing it, after you complete it, honestly, it feels like a disaster. It feels like you just wrote the hardest thing ever. And once you get your mark back, basically it gives you a 3-digit score that correlates to the actual USMLE score. And it'll tell you exactly what, like a kind of a ballpark as to where you're standing right now, what your score would be if that was the actual USMLE exam right then and there. And that's why I loved it so much, because especially after I wrote that first one, it told me kind of where I was standing when I was during my study time, and it pushed me to actually work harder and study harder and make sure I know all my concepts, so that by the time I write that second self-assessment, I'd be good to go for the exam. Another great thing about the Uworld self-assessment is that it tests your endurance. The most important thing when it comes to the USMLE exam, or one of the most important things, is the fact that the exam is so long. It's about 8 or 9 hours long. So when you do these self-assessments, even though it's 4 hours long, it kind of gives you an idea of how you're going to feel when you're writing this taxing exam, this very long exam. So that way it prepares you to answer these questions under pressure, under a time restriction. That way when you write the actual exam, you won't feel any problem at all. You'll still feel a problem, obviously, but I mean, you'll be used to that, because you'll think to yourself, oh, I did those self-assessments, I did 2 of them, they were 4 hours long, you know what I mean, and I got a good mark on them. So that little bit gives you a little bit more confidence when you're actually writing your exam. So that's another great thing about the self-assessments. So another important note to mention when it comes to the self-assessments is if you do score a low score, especially when it's your first self-assessment, that's okay. You have time. That's why I told you guys it's better to write that first self-assessment anytime at your halfway point, or even before that if you feel ready. If you score a low mark, that's okay, because that, as I said with me, it pushes you to study harder, and it makes you motivated to make sure that second self-assessment that you do is going to be a much higher mark. So don't let yourself down if it's a low mark, because you know, if anything, that's just extra motivation. There's also another company that does question banks or self-examinations, and that's called NBME. With NBME, they have exams just like, it's kind of similar to the self-assessment that I told you about that come with Uworld. It's a little different though, because they also have questions that come with for all the different USMLE exams, but they have different forms. So let's say for step 1, I think they have about, I'm not really sure how many, because they're always releasing more. I think they have between 6 and 10. So they'll have form 1, form 2, form 3, and so on. And how it works is you gotta buy them. So one of them I think is about 60 USD. So you purchase one form for 60 USD, and it gives you the same thing. This time I think it's 5 blocks, between 40 and 50 questions per block, and it's similar to the self-assessment where you're in a time constriction and you basically do the entire thing just like how it will be in the actual USMLE exam. So with the NBMEs, you can purchase those and do those questions if you want to, because if anything, what a lot of people will say, it's more questions. Why not be exposed to more questions for the actual exam? In my case, with the NBMEs, they didn't really predict my score very well for neither of the exams that I wrote. So some of that, and a lot of the time, I feel like I would write the NBMEs and I would get a really high score on it, percentage-wise, because I would calculate my percentage after and I'd get a really high score. But the 3-digit score that they would give me was always very, very underestimated, and that kind of always messed with my confidence level when it came to studying for the exam. And then in the end, I always realized that my real exam score was always much higher than what I was scoring on those NBMEs. So I don't know how it is for everyone, if it underestimates or overestimates for certain people, but at least for me, that wasn't the right exam for me. I did do a few, I think I did 3 or 4 for my step 1. If I were to go back, I wouldn't even do that. I would just do my Uworld and my Uworld self-assessments. But yeah, if you guys want to do the NBME, that's fine with me. You know, I would recommend it if you want to be exposed to more questions. There's nothing wrong with it. Alright guys, so the last tip I have for you is going to be talking about the day before and the day of the exam. What I'm going to do is I'm going to give you a quick rundown of how I dealt with my day before and the day of my exam, how I dealt with the whole situation. That way you guys can learn from that and you guys can, you know, kind of take some tips from what I did. So the day is here, your exam is tomorrow. It's going to be one of the most stressful times in your entire life. At least for me, I was having panic attacks. I was having a lot of anxiety. I don't want to scare you guys or anything like that, but I think a lot of people are going to feel similar when it comes to the day before your exam. So you got to plan this out ahead of time. That's what I did. So basically a week before my exam, especially after I wrote my second self-assessment and I scored a high grade and I felt good about myself, I told myself that the day before the exam I will not study at all. I will not touch my pen. I will not open my book. I won't even look at anything to do with the USMLE Step 1. And that's what I did. So the day before my exam, I relaxed all day. I hung out with my family, I hung out with my dog, you know, I tried my best not to think about the exam, although, you know, every once in a while your heart will start beating, but what can you do? So yeah, so that day before the exam, I didn't do anything. The thing is though, what I did the next morning kind of contradicts everything I said, but the next morning, I think I woke up at about 5 in the morning, and for me, my hardest concept was microbiology when it came to the step 1. So I woke up super early and I read through the entire microbio section on my first aid book. And to tell you guys the truth, that didn't even help me at all. All of that reading that I did, I probably forgot all of it by the time I got to the test center. So what I would recommend is up until the day before and even until the exam day, just don't look at anything. Maybe you can write a few topics down, like maybe a few hard topics that you might have a hard time memorizing, and you can just quickly look over it in the morning or the night of before your exam. But other than that, I would really recommend not to do any hardcore studying right before the exam, the night before or the day of, because everything you've learned is already in here. There's nothing more you can really add at that point in time. So the day of my exam, how it went for me was I had a big breakfast. I tried not to drink too much coffee or anything like that because I didn't want any stomach issues or anything like that before my exam. So once I got to the test center, it was very nerve-wracking. I was stressing out a lot because I knew that I've been studying for this exam, and it was my first USMLE exam, so I had even more pressure on me because I didn't want to mess this up, and I haven't written a hard standardized exam like this before ever in my life. So it was very stressful for me, but I sat down, and you know, basically how it works is you have test centers all over the world. My test center was in Canada, so you got in there. The people were very friendly. I think that's what also helped me kind of become a little bit more comfortable. Once I sat down in the cubicle, they give you some headphones that you can wear, some noise canceling headphones. Once you put them on, you know, you won't be able to hear anybody around you, because a lot of the times people around you are writing different exams, not just the USMLE. Sometimes there'll be some people writing English essays and just, you know, constantly typing, and it's a disaster. You know, you don't want to deal with that. So you can even put those headphones on. What I did too was bring a lot of water. You're not allowed to bring the water to the room where you're writing your exam, which is kind of weird, but every time you want to go for water, you can take a break after your block is over. After each block is over, you can take any amount of break that you want. You just press the break button, you leave the room, and you can have a snack or have your water or whatever. During the exam, basically they have about 8 blocks. Each block, they give you 1 hour to do 40 questions. After each block is over, like I said, you can take a break and come back. Every time you leave and come back, you're gonna have to scan your thumbprint, all that stuff. They'll explain all that to you once you get to the test center. But the biggest thing I want to take away from my experience and tell you guys is that I know it's very stressful once you sit down in that chair, but after you finish that first block of questions, I guarantee you a lot of that anxiety, a lot of that stress goes down a lot. Even if the questions were hard, even if, you know, you felt like you failed that block, regardless, the fact that you finished that one block, it gives you all the confidence to finish the rest of the exam. So that's one thing I can take away from my experience and tell you guys, that, you know, I know up until that first block it's a lot of stress, but once you finish that first block, it's going to be a lot easier from then on for the rest of the exam. Another thing with the actual exam is that when I was writing the exam, I honestly felt like I was writing one of those Uworld self-assessments that I was doing at home. That's exactly what it felt like. It felt like I just did 2 of those in a row, and that's what it felt like. And I think the fact that I did those self-assessments really helped me, because when it came to time, I never ran out of time on any questions, because I was accustomed to doing questions under pressure, especially when I was doing the QBank for Uworld. So when I was writing the exam, it literally just felt like I was doing my self-assessments from Uworld, but obviously in a more serious situation. So that's another reason why I recommend this so much to you guys, to take those Uworld self-assessments and the QBank seriously. When you're doing them, make sure you're doing them like it's an actual exam. That way, when you're sitting in the real exam, you're not going to feel that much of a difference, and that feeling that there's not much of a difference, that gives you a lot of confidence as well during the actual exam. Alright guys, well those are my tips for the USMLE Step 1. If you guys have any other questions for me, please comment down below. I'll be sure to respond to them as soon as possible. Please leave a like and also subscribe to my channel. I'll be releasing more videos as soon as I can, giving you guys some more Medvice. And yeah, I hope to see you guys soon. Thanks so much for watching.